So, Michael, I want to start a conversation with you with this enormous, crazy question, which underlies my life, I think. And that's why I wanted to talk to other people who have been exploring life in a deep way. And that question is hard to put into words, but it's something like, what is this we're experiencing? Do you think? And is there something we should be doing with it? Do you think? And, here am I, just 60, here's you in your 30s, and yet we're both in this very mysterious experience. And, I'm wondering how it looks to you at this place on your journey and what you've made of it.
Yeah. Well, right now I'm in the midst of reading Eric Davis's fantastic new book, High Weirdness.
I don't know, but it's a great name.
Oh, it's a masterpiece of what he's trying to define as weird naturalism. He's playing with like an academic overview or investigation into the life and writings of the McKenna brothers, of Philip K. Dick, and of Robert Anton Wilson, and saying that there was something going on in the 70s in the exploration of ontology that's really important and is lensed through these three characters and their stories in a very important way. And he draws on Bruno Latour, and he draws on Deleuze and Guattari, and he builds this case for a naturalism that accepts these folded over subject and object, and the way that the plurality of reality, that every engagement that we have with the human or the non-human proliferates realities. And it's an interesting way to think about this as, like I'm very fond, and I think we've talked about this on my show. I'm very fond of the idea of evolution as a process that is, as Richard Doyle said in his work, and Doyle is quoted in Eric Davis's stuff, that evolution is like a search algorithm for maximal entropy, but it does it through these feeling, sensate minded agents, that are orienting themselves through the way that they interpret their environments. And so there's like this manifold of subjectivity, and Eric talks a little bit about this in High Weirdness, in the part I'm reading now, where he's talking about, rather than what does he call it, it's some sort of like introjection of subjectivity through the folding over of the other. And so It's just, so to answer your question, I think
go for it.
I think that what I'm gesturing toward here, and what I see all of these authors gesturing toward, is that what we're experiencing here is a play of perspectives that is like proliferating like a river valley or something, that it's fractaling out in its folding over itself.
Got it. I was a bit lost, but then when you wrapped it up at the end, I got it.
Okay.
So I think I love that idea of perspectives, and evolution. The evolutionary process, for me, would be exactly that kind of fractaling, or the multiplication, or the deepening as well, or the realization of perspectives in more emergent ways, that coming out, and that everything. I'm very interested in the idea that things are not just objects, that anything that has an integrity is also a perspective, even down to a very primitive level. So you could see the whole thing as, well, everything has, it is an evolution of perspectives. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely, we talked about this a little bit off channel, that I worked with Ken Wilber for a little while, and I'm definitely influenced by his stuff as well, and his influence from Alfred North Whitehead, that, you know, this, what if even a photon has like a quantum unit of interiority? And, you know, when I studied Ken's stuff in grad school under Sean Hargens, who is a very rigorous and interesting mind when it comes to pluralism, and, you know, he's taken Ken's work, I think, into some extraordinary new developments, you know, looking at the way that the world is this sort of Indra's net type situation, everything reflecting everything else. And Sean turned me on to Francisco Varela. And so, like, Francisco Varela and Umberto Maturana back in the 80s and 90s were working on autopoiesis, and this sort of, you know, the cybernetics of how the mind emerges through an, you know, an interface of the organism and its environment.
So yeah. I have a bit of I have a little bit of trouble with the word interiority.
All right.
Just because it sounds like it's got something inside. It's in, you know, there's an inside, and I don't know about you, but I'm not experiencing an inside. I'm just experiencing, on the one hand, the world, and on another hand, the imagination. And so I wonder, let me throw this at you and see how it resonates with what you're saying. That the place I've ended up is thinking in terms of just subjectivity, that everything has everything which, if the one thing is developing into relatively separate flows of time, processes, as Whitehead would say, then everything which could be regarded as individual has what makes it individual is it has an individual relationship with the whole. So it has a subjectivity. So whether it's a, you know, an atom or a plant or you and me, that there's a subjective relationship with the whole, and it's that which is the perspective. So it's we don't have to make up in something, you know, it's not like it has an interiority or it's conscious, or it's just it's just in some way reading the whole, whether it's electrochemically or then sensually or then conceptually.
Yeah, and in fact, I'm totally comfortable using whatever different language.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. In one way, it doesn't seem like it matters, but in another way, I think it really does.
Yeah. Well, let's play with that a little, because one of the scientists whose work I encountered last year that changed the way that I think about this stuff pretty profoundly was Adi Livnat of Haifa University in Israel, who came through the Santa Fe Institute, where I work doing science communication. And he gave a talk on interaction-based evolution, and specifically a Hebbian learning model, meaning like the neurons that fire together wire together, that notion of how it is that our brain learns. And he applied it to genetic regulatory networks and said that he thinks that that we can see, even in what we're thinking of as random mutations, a kind of I'm going to say this like a poet, not a scientist, but a kind of striving toward the best fit, that there is a kind of, you know, as things are seeking rest, that includes, you know, you think of evolution as this multi-scale thing that includes all of the little individual units of it. And when you look at the way that the shape of an organic molecule and the shape of its environment of organic molecules, even like within our individual cells, is sifting around through like supposedly random movement into these configurations that are like information compression algorithms, then it looks like what we want to attribute to like a minded sense of purpose at the human scale, you know, the way that people talk about like, you want to anthropomorphize everything, but it's there in nature, and it seems to be the basis for, you know, that there's some sense in which this directionality in evolution that a lot of people intuit and a lot of people have, until I think fairly recently in the sciences, really rejected, but it's starting to come back.
Yeah.
You know,
yeah.
that this directionality is about the way that the anatomy is a model of the environment in an evolutionary system.
Say that again. Say that again.
That the anatomy, that every organism is like a hypothesis of the ecosystem about like how to survive, right? And so there are all of these ways that I think, in a way, like people might accuse me of projecting human attributes into the world, but I think what it actually is sort of the opposite. That
yes, exactly.
We have extracted that we talk about these things in a human way, that we don't have excellent language for, this proto subjectivity,
proto everything,
or like a grand subjectivity that would be like the thoughts that our entire civilization is having as an entity.
Okay,
you know?
hold that. I gotta wind back a sec because I'm gonna lose you. So I really get. I think what you're saying is, and I really get this, and I work with this a lot of trying to find a language to express it in. The idea that what gets dismissed as an anthropomorphic understanding actually is really a recognition that everything that is human has arisen in the evolutionary process and has a precursor, which goes back and back and back and back. So the thing which we experience as intention isn't there previously, but the thing it's evolved from is, and that there's a kind of a primal current which will become you and I intending to have this conversation, for instance.
Yeah,
and I get so that makes real sense to me. I think that's what you're saying. Is that right?
Well, yeah. I mean, to clarify, I think that in the sort of primal sense that these things are distributed, that intelligence, that what we think of as what I'm calling intentionality, probably problematically, is distributed in the landscape, and then over time it gets focused into the working models that beings navigating that landscape carry around within us and adapt, and that those working models are like again, I'm using a word that you've already sort of pointed to as an issue, but there's a kind of internalization of the landscape into the models of the landscape that we carry as a necessity, as a way for an ecosystem to understand itself. Okay.
Again.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
Have another go.
All right.
I'll get there.
And so at any rate, like, I do think that there is, I tend to think of these things as like, there always was a noosphere. There always was a layer of mind around the planet, but it was diffuse. It wasn't integrated. It wasn't focused into, it wasn't localized in the kind of way that it is now. And because it wasn't localized, it wasn't able to, it wasn't as diverse internally. It wasn't as heterogeneous as it is now. But
so what does that look like for you? There's two things which come up for me there. One is, I have no idea why Pierre de Chardin talked about the noosphere as surrounding the planet. I've never got that, because it always feels like my experience of the noosphere, which I'm experiencing right now, obviously having this conversation with you, is it doesn't exist anywhere. It's clearly non-spatial. So the idea that it's around the planet seems very kind of strange to me. So I don't get that. And why he said that, and I don't. I want to. So that's one thing I want to ask you about. And then the other thing is the idea that you've just said then of it there being a mind, noosphere, imagination, whatever this thing we're experiencing in some proto, less individuated version of it is what I'm hearing. What is that, and why do we need to have that previous? What isn't it more elegant just to see it evolving as a very emergent level? I mean, I'm quite open to it being already there. I just can't see what it is when it's already there.
Okay, so first of all, these are great. I love these, and I'm honored that I'm ever in a conversation where I'm sort of given the deputized to answer these questions as if I know. But it seems as though, one, that maybe Terre de Chardin, living when he did, was literalizing the metaphor that he inherited from the Victorian era of the mind as some sort of radio, and that this notion that, like, the Russians went really deep into this in their Cold War research about, is consciousness a magnetic phenomenon embedded in the magnetic envelope of the planet, and it's interesting stuff. So I think there's something to that. But again, it is an instance where maybe the technological metaphor has been, stretched to the breaking point. And then obviously what I'm talking about, as what I'm thinking of as the noosphere being, this sort of the mental dimension of the biosphere, so to use this problematic,
okay,
like the interiority of the biosphere. But I think to your second question, why I find it helpful or useful or perhaps more accurate to regard mind as, or to regard all of these things as having some sort of proto state rather than being truly emergent, is that, okay, we know that things are truly emergent. Do we? I mean, the thing is that we notice, we
do. Surely we do know that.
Hold on now. Like, we see that our systems are like bounded wherever we look. We're, for the purposes of scientific clarity, that we have to draw a line around a thing, which automatically forecloses the possibility that our evolutionary emergence are distributed across a much larger system at a different scale than the scale that we're observing things. And like, science only recently has started moving into these multi-scale considerations where you're not just looking at things that, like that. It's not that chemistry. I think we're still foot wet, standing in the puddle of the previous paradigm in which biology emerges out of chemistry and chemistry emerges out of physics.
Why do you think that? I mean, given that, the current understanding would be, 13.8 billion years ago there was hydrogen, and now there's you and me having this conversation. That seems pretty emergent, doesn't it?
Oh yeah, but I just, every day I am embedded in a conversation where people are banging their heads against the wall about the point at which life emerged.
Yeah, and that's a different thing, though, isn't it?
The origin.
That's a different thing. I had Bruce Demer came to my birthday party in Glastonbury, which was lovely. So I got to, and so we've talked a great deal about like that question, and and of course that's a big question. In fact, I suspect it's not just when did life emerge, it's when did anything new emerge is actually a really difficult question, because you've got, but that it's emerged and that you can see a before and after is pretty, like I can look out in the garden, I can see the difference between things that are alive and things which aren't. Although when it, if I look up close, exactly where that boundary is may be really hard to say, but but I can.
So maybe there are two useful ways to talk about this, right? Like, maybe it's useful to talk about something as emerging in the same way that someone emerges onto stage, and we know that there's a backstage.
Okay, so all right, so that's a non-creative emergence.
Mm-hmm. Like, that's a situation where, like, a pattern that you. And this is the way that emergence is used for, what I'm about to say is the way that emergence is used formally, which is like, the way that an interference pattern emerges when you lay two like gauzy cloths over one another. And, the moire. And the moire, like, isn't, it's not like something new was created except to our awareness of it.
Okay.
So I think that, for me, it's very problematic to talk about the beginnings of life as anything. And I get into this with Bruce. I've been getting into this with Bruce for 5 years, and it really meaningful, constructive way that I think we both appreciate, which is that I think his model demonstrates a kind of just a focusing of inferential and learning processes in the landscape into the warm little pond, and that in a sense that really it would be fair to say that biology is like an epiphenomenon of geology in that sense.
If you don't see it as reductionist, yeah. If you don't reduce it
Right.
to it, and that's why I guess why the idea of just the word emergent seems like a good word, because something I want to just pause this 1 second, because I want to go back to something you said earlier and just point out a difference in the way I've come to think of things, and just see if it makes a difference in what you're exploring. Because you said, I see the noosphere as the interiority, or whatever word we use, doesn't matter, of the biosphere. And I wanted to come back to that, because I really don't. And that's been a big jump for me. And I'd like to just to see whether I can make sense of it to you and what you think. Because if I come down to my experience right now, I'm experiencing a flow of sensation and a flow of imagination. I'm the biosphere and the noosphere, if you like. There is a tendency to see all of that experience as somehow the subjective aspect of the body. Whereas it seems to me that there is this experience of sensation that I'm having is the subjective experience of the body. But the experience of imagination, this non-spatial dimension that I'm having, is another level of reality altogether, which I suspect has evolved from this, but which is now a completely different level of information, in the same way that biology is actually a different level of information to physics now. And it's just working on a different level. And physics passes, atoms pass through my biological level, and in the same way, this experience of psyche or soul is a completely new level of emergence, and it has its own objectivity and subjectivity. So that rather than that being like there just being the body and then this subjective side of it, actually both have an objectivity and a subjectivity to them. And so the noosphere is a realm in its own right, a dimension of emergence in its own right, which has arisen from the biosphere incrementally, and which now exists in its own right, excrementally, yeah. Incrementally. And
well, maybe it is. I mean, maybe it is.
Okay. I mean, that's
the metabolic output of this. So I'm really. It's interesting. I find I don't really settle one way on this or the other, and so this conversation is going to be interesting, because I feel like, in a way, what you just said sounds like I'm inclined to offer the same kind of question about that you offer to interiority, which is why what is it in your experience that feels as though those two things are of ontologically different orders, that they are
the starting place is that they're without doubt experientially completely different. So that's my starting place, is that there is a complete difference between my experience of this mug and the idea of the mug are utterly different things, one of which is spatial and I have access to it through sensation. The other is an image. It doesn't exist in space and inhabits its own dimension. And that's a dimension I can explore in dreams. I can do it on psychedelics. I can do it in meditation. And my hunch is I can do it at death. So I'm interested really in taking that experiential basis and going, okay, so maybe the perennial spiritual idea that there is a soul dimension, the bardos, the imaginal realms, and that we're in it all the time, that we're always in these two levels of, maybe that can be taken seriously, and we don't have to, but that I guess the thing which I'm trying to add to the spiritual philosophy and move it on is an evolutionary element, which goes, but maybe that has evolved in this process which science has beautifully articulated, from physics to biology to psyche. That is an emergence of ever greater depth of information, and new levels of reality are arising. In that way, and the reason I want to come back to is because in that way it feels really creative to me. That it's the arising of something new all the time. In that way that again Whitehead talked about, that there is something creative.
Maybe I just like being a bummer or a contrarian. I don't think so, because I feel like I rapture at the same sort of spiritual horizon that you do. But I tend to think, when I think of evolution as the deepening of networks of sensing, feeling, communicating intellects that are deepening in an sort of a ratcheting effort to understand the environment that they themselves are making more complex.
Yep.
That what they are doing is modeling an environment that is inexhaustible, even though it's somehow made more complex by our doing. It's also it's inexhaustible to our models, and like it's greater than we will ever understand by definition. And
Sure.
so it seems as though all of the information and all of the creation coming out of this is coming in. And I guess the sort of tactile example would be one of those little desktop wave machines full of sand, where you tilt it one way and the water rushes down and all the sand back, like refluxes back up.
Yeah.
That there's, to talk about evolution, I think has to be paired with the notion of involution. Like Richard Doyle talks about involution as a deepening of subjectivity. But
okay,
so like he's a Advaita Vedanta type thinker in terms of that all of the manifest form and the creative possibility expressed in our world is like projected, or it's drawn down from the imagination.
So this is really a kind of Plotinus and all of that, isn't it? And going back to a very old view. And I had this out with Ken Wilber actually just recently.
You're not on it, right?
No, I just think why do we need that? I tell you what it is, Mike. I was just thinking about this today. What's underneath for me, I think, is I really like simple. I really like it when you can get it down and go, whoa, that, and then explore that. And one of in my work on spirituality and mythology for years, I've been exploring this very common idea, that God, Brahman, whatever, the spirit is realizing itself, is expressing itself, is knowing itself. This is a really ancient motif. And I think what happened some time ago was I thought, well, what happens if you take that seriously? I mean, really seriously. And you go, what existence is a process of potentiality realizing itself in more emergent ways. And taking that hypothesis, because it just feels like, wow, that's a really elegant idea of what this is, because it looks to me like every new moment is realizing a new potentiality based on what's been before. And that seems to be always true of every moment I've experienced in my 60 years. And here it is again. So let's take it seriously, in which case it is the whole scope of the evolution of this universe and maybe universes before, that the coming into existence of more emergent things based on what's been before. And with the birth of the universe, just like the birth of my body, it didn't start with me being conscious. It started with an egg and a sperm. It started with, something very, very basic. And from that became more emergent. There wasn't any involution involved. It was just like start simple, become richer. Now that's a sequence, obviously I had parents, and maybe our universe has parents. Maybe the past is always informing the next thing that happens. But there's something it feels like this whole involution thing, it seems like the leftover of the fall. which is the spiritual motif, not evolution, the idea that we've fallen from somewhere already perfect. And so I'm interested in, do we need that now? Or can we see a much more positive thing? Go on.
I definitely think that, I'm about the balance of seemingly contradictory perspectives.
Oh, me too.
Yeah. So like this, and I think really like the real is somewhere between the two towers we've erected here, and seem to be like.
But there has to be a good reason for that.
Yeah. So okay.
What is involution giving us that we can't get from the idea that we're starting from something, potentiality realizing itself in primitive ways, which is what the scientific story seems to tell us, and that will become conscious of itself, and that will become then images of sensation in consciousness, and then we've got a whole new realm, rather than there being some sort of, what does that fall? What does that coming down from something which is already there? What is it?
Well, it's not okay. So I actually gave a talk that people can find on my page of talks at Burning Man in I guess this was, anyway, it was 2013, and it was called Viewed from the Horizon. And in the talk, I critiqued both cosmologies that are based on this entropic decay and models that are based on this sort of this eruption towards an omega point, because both of there's something, both the sort of apotheosis at the end of time and the immaculate garden to which we can never return seem to me to be almost culturally determined slices of something that contains, includes, and transcends both of those things. And like, I really, I'm just inclined to adopt a kind of relativistic attitude towards this, where we have to, it's humility ultimately, I think, for me, in not, in wondering where the order, where the information comes from. Like, is information really created? Hold on just a second. Again, I think, I may sound like I'm spiraling the drain here.
Not the slightest.
Okay, but I think, the question of, let me just put two things on the table for you and see what sticks. One is the work of Jessica Flack, who's a collective computation researcher at the Santa Fe Institute. And she wrote a paper called Coarse Graining as Downward Causation. So I think this would appeal to your aesthetic. And the idea is, she studied under Frans de Waal, the primate researcher. And so she's thinking about this in terms of macaque dominance hierarchies, that every macaque has to not only be able to sort of size up another macaque and know, am I going to win or lose this fight? But also aggregate and estimate a public sentiment from the rest of the macaque troop over whether they think I'm going to win or lose this fight. Like, how am I polling right now? And she said that in this paper, she showed the math of this is that a kind of group mind emerges out of all of the individual estimates. Like, if you regard each macaque in this troop as a node in a distributed computational network, that each one of them is coming up with an answer that's like a local answer about a global quality of the network. And each of us might be getting that answer wrong in some, we're like erring or varying in some way, but collectively our variance creates the wisdom of a crowd. And that there is some, that our own little individual calculations create this, this thing that among humans is experienced as the social contract. This sense that I have that there's a point at which the predominant relationship is not the relationship between you and I. It's the relationship between you and I as mediated by our relationship to society itself and the regulatory system that we understand ourselves to be participating in, whether that's, a religious god or whatever. And for what it's worth, monotheism shows up in history. This is a recent publication. All of the monotheistic religions show up as a function of population size, like density, like cities walling and creating legal and religious structures for their own internal regulation, or so it seems. And that, so in a sense, this notion, maybe the simpler thing I would sort of provoke playfully is that that this seemingly distinct space has emerged for us as the product of these kind of social calculations that we have to do. And I'm just playing here, but the other one. Okay.
I want to make sure I've got that. So are you just saying? Oh, just saying. Are you saying, look, the experience of psyche has arisen from all of that?
Possibly.
I think you're right. I would think I would think that's a large part of it, because it's a communal space.
Yeah, that there's a sense reading her paper in which I felt the Holy Ghost descend into the room. But that's the descent of the Holy Ghost is the point at which I think this conversation is taking some, is investigating, is there really a descent of the Holy Ghost? Or does the Holy Ghost only seemingly descend as we just like...
Well, there's definitely in and out going on the whole time. And it's going, now, I think really the only thing which I'm questioning is do we put can we keep the more emergent till later? Do we have to put it near the beginning? Does it have to come from this down? Or even if it does, is that simply because, a bit like my egg and sperm thing, is a bit like, well, for me, it started really simple. Like for this universe, it started really simple again. But actually, everything is a continuation of the past. Even that was a continuation of the past. And in that way, it's all being informed by intelligence, which is the past, which is the way things have already been done.
Well, I mean, I'm way out of my depth here talking about cosmology and astrophysics, but I remember physics is puzzling over the fact that the Big Bangs, like the earliest moment of our universe, was actually exceedingly high entropy. It was like maximal entropy. And then somehow it went from high entropy to low entropy. And now we're going back to high entropy. And so that seems puzzling to me. It seems like we're taking a slice of a higher dimensional image and we can't make sense of it. I want to throw this other one on top of this, though, because I've been talking about this playing with this particular idea has changed the way I think about this stuff entirely.
Okay.
Eric Wargo, the author of Time Loops, Precognition, Retrocausation, and the Unconscious. So he's made this really, I think, eloquent case that, I know that you spoke to Rupert Sheldrake, and so if he's listening, I apologize. But he makes the case that stuff like Sheldrake's research, or in general parapsychological research, that seems to indicate it's frequently been suggested it's like a quantum spooky action at a distance, or some kind of weird thing going on there. He's saying that actually, what if it is your foreknowledge, some sort of information reflux from future states of your own brain, and that like if you have a sense that somebody's about to call you on the phone, and then they do, and then you're like, oh my gosh, that just happened. It's like, actually, there's a datum sort of in a Mobius strip in time, locking. For me. So hold on. So his whole thing is that he is ravaged by Occam's razor. Like he is like a rabid devotee of the simplest possible explanation. And for him, the simplest possible explanation to explain all of these anomalous phenomena as well as everything else is that we live in a block universe, the Minkowski space-time, where the future is there already.
How awful. Oh, how do I do that? Oh, I mean, my whole life is just draining away. This conversation has no purpose. Everything's already happened. Your children are already dead. Their futures are fixed. It's pointless doing anything. Let us give up now. What an awful, ugly, grotesque idea that is, Michael.
Is there another way to backbend intellectually around
It's hard to find an idea which I find so repulsive and so without foundation. As that horrible, horrible idea that this thing we're in is so uncreative and so meaningless that it's a block. It's like even the name.
It's uncreative. I mean, it's just like
to think if it's already happened, it's uncreative. It means this. You would say that, wouldn't you? And if your brain had only had the foresight, it would have known that. Maybe you thinking of the idea is only exactly that it's already happened. So I really hate that with passion, because it feels like what we're in here is much more than that. This is a process, and that's such a dead idea. For me, it's like, look, every moment is new. That's what it is. It's creative. And you and I are expressions of that. And this creativity we're experiencing is an expression of the creativity that started the whole thing off and has been in the ground ever since. And it's
Is there a way to reconcile these two?
I don't think so. I really do not think so. I really don't. I think the idea, the idea that time is fixed just kills everything. And it's also so counterintuitive. I mean, if you're going to use Occam's razor, bloody use it, because what we actually experience is not that. What we experience is that every moment realizes a new creative potential and includes within it, which is fixed. So the expanding block universe, as it sometimes gets called, that I can go with. What's happened has happened. That's fixed. But just as the universe is space expanding, it's time expanding and it's accumulating. And everything that's happening is arising on and contains within it the past, what's happened before. But that's a creative process. And the reason, for me, much simpler, that we experience the sort of things that Rupert explores is just simply that we also exist on a non-spatial dimension. Nothing to do with quantum physics. Quantum physics is right down at the beginning. It's a very low level of the rising of possibility, where particles are coming in and out. This is a very high level. This is a very emergent level, and we're in it right now. And we're passing, and we're connecting. I'm connected with something I can't see right now, aren't I? I mean, I'm looking at your face on a screen, but what I'm connecting with is your soul, is your psyche, and it has no physical form. And yet I'm connecting with it, and we're passing immaterial things to and fro. And my suspicion, and I think this is what people like Rupert are exploring, my suspicion is we're actually connected there the whole time, but we're connected through the bonds that you are connected with your child, say, or your partner, or your parents, or your best friends, or it's like the connections are not to do with meaning. They're not to do with spatiality. Mm-hmm. Just like our ideas, I say an idea and it connects with a book you've read. It's nothing to do with spatiality. It's to do with connections of meaning. So that there's a spatial temporal, there's a spatial causal world, which is this one, and then from it has arisen a narrative, meaningful image world, which we're in, and we connect.
I'm curious, so this notion that you say maybe we've been connected the whole time in this non-spatial.
Well, in the same way that we're connected in this one, it was just in this one we're connected because we're all part of the one biosphere and one universe. It's just that we need to be physically close to each other to know that. In the non-spatial, it feels like we just need to be meaningfully close to each other to know that. And when you are, you do, which is why when something happens, when someone rings you and you go, oh, someone's got knew that, and you pick up on it before it happens because you're actually close to them, but not spatially. Just as if I was close to you spatially and you picked up your phone, I go, well, I knew you were ringing because I could see you.
Right. Right. So, what do you make then? Because my thing is that the reason I find my position on matters such as these to be so paradoxical and multiplex is that I feel like I have to stretch myself to accommodate all of the anomalies. And like
me too.
One of the persistent anomalies is my own intuitions of future events.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, in your model, how
does that happen?
Yeah, how to make sense of something, of these experiences of people, like, for example, in Wargo, in his book, he talks a lot about, the people that anticipate like a large public disaster like Titanic or 9/11,
mm-hmm.
and their dreams about it, or their stories are reflections not of how they might have experienced it themselves had they been there, but how they experienced it, how they were later going to experience it by reading about it or watching it on TV. And so that there's this sense in which, the evidence that we have for premonition, although, anecdotal, although hugely anecdotal, suggests, one, that prophecy is obviously filtered through the rear-facing associative relationships that we use. That we can only make sense of a premonition in light of the experience that we have up to this point. But it's there.
Yeah, I take that seriously. I just don't think it's because the future's fixed. I think it's much more like a view from a hill. It's like, I'm going over there. And I think it's more like, I can predict with complete accuracy that this will fall. I can absolutely predict that. I can predict with some accuracy that I'll go in the house later on and have my evening meal. That may not happen, but it will.
One hopes.
And yeah, one hopes. So for me, it's like, look, with the arising of this soul dimension, the psyche as a whole, as a meaningful narrative dimension, we've seen the universe, which started as basic matter, turn into a story. So that's a fundamental key idea for me. Is it's become a story, it's become a dream. And we're in it. It's just not just that. It is also a mechanical level and biological level, but it is turned into this thing we're having. And all of those levels are affecting each other. So there is a narrative level to existence now. And that narrative level of existence, just as you can foresee things in the physical and biological levels, you can foresee things in the narrative level. But each level is more creative. So you can the narrative, the physical level is not very creative. It's very slow to be creative. So you can predict things to incredible accuracy and land spaceships on comets. Biologically, not so easy. In the world of narrative, not so easy, but still possible. And still occasionally it will arise in somebody's story that they're going to have a premonition of something that's coming. Of course, the only ones you ever notice are the ones that turn out right. There may be hundreds and hundreds which could have done that, but never happened. So we may be having these narrative precognition all the time, just as we're having causal precognition all the time. It may be a common occurrence. We just only notice the dramatic ones that actually happen, because all the ones that don't happen, we don't pay any attention to. So I still see it as a creative process. I don't think we need to go to this block dead, it's all happened. We're just, that we don't have to go to that awfulness straight away. I think there's other creative options.
I really want to get into the aesthetic repulsion that you seem to experience here. If I may, as the guest on your show.
You may. Let's do it, my friend.
Yeah, because, I think that Doyle and perhaps Wargo, and they're drawing on a cosmology that I think owes a lot to the cyclic cosmologies of Hinduism and Buddhism, and that there's a sense in which the creative moment is not in the past. And I'm fully with you that it's like it's unpleasant to consider this sort of God just did the thing and now it's just all just diffusing.
It's inherent in all forms of determinism. It's inherent in reductionism. It's not. Most scientists, if you push them hard, would probably end up having to go with it. They just don't want to think about it. So it's not.
Yeah,
I mean, I do get that it's a common idea. Sorry, go on.
Well, like you and I both, both insist that creation is ongoing, but
so how do you square that, Michael?
so the sense that I get is that we're missing an axis here, that we're missing a dimension, and that the dimension is, that in our efforts to place, you got Big Bang on one end, you got the singularity on the other end, and they both feel like low dimensional projections of a higher dimensional reality, and that it's our efforts to narrativize. I called it in 2008. I wrote an essay about Burning Man, in which I talk about being overwhelmed by the creative profusion of the event and realizing that my sequential experience of time is a low dimensional abstraction of the buzzing profusion of the creativity of reality itself, and that the whole time I've been mistaking a party for a parade, and that this notion of like a parade, that where you locate creativity in a cyclic model, or a model that is at the universal scale seemingly static, is that it's actually that there is this axis in which the universe is being recreated in every moment, and
I completely agree with that. That sounds like the opposite of what you were saying before to me, Michael.
Evolutionary arc is present.
Isn't that the opposite of what you were saying?
I mean, maybe a 90-degree angle. It's like I don't feel especially mercurial or tricksy, but I recognize that we are trapped in the prison of language, and that sometimes
we are. But there's a fundamental difference and how we see. So I'm. Jesus, for most people, I'm Mr. Paradox. My whole paralogical thinking is about bringing opposites together. But it's not, how we bring them together is about avoiding contradiction, I think, and seeing how they complement. So there is a cyclic level experience in time, for sure, right from the day cycling, the year cycling, maybe a whole universe is cycling. But it's like a wheel. It's going forward. It's not, because each new year is the year again, but it's another year. And so that the past, there's always more past. Every moment is always an accumulation. There's always more past. So what's being created is there, it seems to me. So, but the creativity, I would say, is right here always. That each moment is a meeting or a coexistence of the past and the possible. Everything that has been and everything that could be. It's not just everything that's happened and what is going to happen but hasn't happened yet. It's like it's something formless, something non-dual spirit, something utterly creative. The potentiality meeting everything that's already been realized. So there's being and becoming, formless and form, and that's what makes the moment. And that leaves that which you lose completely if you have a blocked universe where everything is kind of just already happened.
All right, so this all sort of calls to mind Alan Watts talking about life as experienced in two ways. One, to live through it beginning to end, to experience it from within, and then the other, to see the music on the paper, as it were. To recognize it as a symphony or a poem with themes and variation, and
that's a great analogy. So the question is what we're doing now, playing from a script, playing from, or are we riffing? Is this jazz? Or because it feels like jazz to me. This feels like jazz. This feels like this is we're making this up as we go along, based on what's happened before. We're not playing the notes that are on the stand in front of us, and that's the key. I think it's a great analogy for getting, which are we talking about here? And it feels to me like the whole point is it's creative. I mean, where I want to go with this, really, I think, is to, do come back on me with that. But where it feels like I want to go is back to the very first question, which is, what is this and what should we do with it? Because if this is already fixed, then the second question disappears. If it's not
I don't know,
fixed,
actually, because in my own, we've never spoken about this, actually, I don't think, but over the last 10 years, I have been, cultivating a deepening relationship to my own intuitive, whatever you might call it, an inner voice or a guidance or a knowing. And for a few years, I A/B tested disobedience. And
I love you for that. I just love you for that. That is so cool.
so like you
Oh,
don't know, like you don't
that's
like, okay,
brilliant.
so it's
That's
just little
brilliant.
simple questions. Should I take a left around this tree, or should I fork to the
Yeah,
right? You
yeah,
know, and I found that every time I disobeyed, quote unquote, whatever this is, completely bracketing any kind of reality claims about what is talking here.
yeah,
Is it inside me? Is it outside me? Not the point. The point is it giving me useful information?
yeah.
And after a few years of systematically disobeying the insights, I felt like I knew that I was getting good information, and that something must know more about my own trajectory than I do.
Yeah, I would agree
And
with that.
yeah, and so yeah, I think that there's, what do you do with it? I got to a point where um, I decided that sobriety, my definition of sobriety, is how integrated is your decision making and your like perception. How much of your body are you listening to in a given moment? How much of your full being, to you know to put it in that way. And that, if we make decisions from small, narrow, urgent places, the voice of the sugar addiction or whatever, then that's what we call intoxication. And that it's not about exogenous or endogenous substances, but it's about what Tononi and Koch call integrated information. How where does my sense of the sort of horizon, the conscious envelope of my being and the other begin? And so even if like Sri Aurobindo was super into getting people, disabusing people of the notion that enlightenment was this painstaking, laborious, long process. You might get enlightened at the end of your life. He's like, no, we need people enlightened now so that they can begin the more interesting part of the project, which is exploring that non-duality. And like you've gotten there, like you're doing this, you're in there with people saying, okay, like let's talk about awakening here. We don't need to like work towards a thing that's already here. And I think, in what I'm describing, I see that there's still room to grow, like, because you don't have perfect, even if we can say sort of theoretically that future already exists, we don't have perfect knowledge of it. And if this is Leela, if this is play, if this is exploration, then it is about deepening into that self as other, the terrain that is us but appears
That's beautiful.
that manifests as other to us. And so this notion, like, I'm so in a sense so like bored with conversations about free will versus determinism, because neither seems to satisfy the complexity of what's actually going on here in terms of the location of the subject and the simple boundary between what
Yeah,
I believe is me making a choice and what I regard as fate impinging itself upon me. And so I think it's really just, it's this thing of moving into a terrain that we know one day will feel familiar, to us that we will regard as that there, you know, to talk about this as a deepening integration and an expansion, and to talk about it as a like getting lost in ever more finely resolved rabbit holes, you know, is the paradox that I want to hold here. You know, that this is both that we are, if you know, that we are the universe exploring every creative possibility, every opportunity.
Yeah.
That there is a wholeness implicit in that from the start.
Wholeness, yeah.
Yeah, and that sobriety has, you know, that my sense of sobriety has a lot to do with the, you know, like a Teilhard de Chardin kind of sense of the deepening integration of intelligence. But he talked about hyper collectivization and hyper personalization being two sides of the same coin. And like, as you know, to the extent that, you know, life is an entropy maximizing search algorithm exploring all of creative possibility, then that is how we hold these two seemingly contradictory narrative slices in which the universe is decaying into warm mush, and also somehow ramping up into ecstatic interconnected order and awareness. And so it's really hard to, like, once I kind of decided that all narrative vectors were low dimensional abstractions of the richness of my experience, then I got really comfortable telling all kinds of different evolutionary stories. But they are like, I'm actually totally comfortable with a universe that defeats our expectations about what is emerging out of what. And, you know, like this, to me, it's just like, if momentum is conserved, if energy is conserved, I think I suspect we'll get to a point where we realize that information is also conserved. I
completely agree. Yeah, definitely.
And that for information to be conserved, then that's why, to answer your question earlier, that's why I want there to be a diffuse, you know, why I think it makes sense in a simple way to talk about the biosphere having been there before the biosphere, you know, and that there was a bios that is localized as a biosphere, you know, but that there's something about what we call emergence.
It feels to me when I'm hearing you that there's a kind of confusion there, to be honest, because it feels like that there's two things. One of which is that it is individuation, so that you've got the things becoming particular. So you can see that. We're
recording this on Carl Jung's birthday, by the way.
Is it really?
Shout out to Carl Jung and individuation. Yeah. Sorry, please continue.
What a dude he was. I didn't know that. He's come up a lot recently. So that things have become particular. And that you can see that. So if you just leave the biosphere for a moment and just go, well, in the world of physical matter, things have become particular and more holonic depth and blah, blah, blah. And they've particularized, and we started with hydrogen and helium, and now we got all of this. So it's all one thing, and it all existed. It was already one thing, and it particularized. And then you can see, I think, maybe the biosphere the same, you know, that it's arising as life, and then it's particularizing. So it is all one thing. It's going to become an ecology of different life forms, but it's all coming from one thing. And the same with the psyche. So that there's that sense in which, but that doesn't mean that the biosphere was already there before there was matter or before there was stars. Or to me, it just means that it exists as potentiality. Presumably, we can say, you know, whatever this formless thing which is manifesting itself, realizing itself, is a potentiality for everything it's going to realize. So it exists there as potentiality, but it exists as nothing. Everything's there as potentiality. And so But as it arises, it will arise as one thing which is individualizing, because the whole thing is one thing which is individualizing. And then when you talk about that deep voice, it feels to me like what's happening is that one thing which is individualizing through soul, through this experience we're having on this very emergent level, at least in this little planet, that is becoming conscious of itself. The whole awakening thing for me is like, through my particularness, the universe goes, fuck, I'm the universe. Mm-hmm. By being Tim. And at that moment, I'm connecting with something much bigger than me. And when I go deep into, and when I listen to that voice, that's the deepest part of my soul. That's the part of me that's connected to God, as the universe conscious of itself, not as where it's come from, but where it's going. And therefore, when I tune into that voice, that's the most emergent level that I can touch. And therefore, it won't be perfect for sure, but it's going to be the wisest thing that Tim can listen to, because it's the wisest part of what Tim is.
So there's a kind of epistemic humility, I think, that we can port through here. And both of us agree that there is a sort of transcendental intelligence, I think, that we're glimpsing from different angles.
For sure. The difference for me from where I was 10 years, 20 years ago, most of my life, is that I used to go along with the more traditional idea of that's already there, whereas it feels more, it attracts me far more now to think, no, it's the most emergent comes last, not first. The universe is flowering into God. It's flowering into this intelligence. Or if you want to use the old mythology, Brahman without qualities is turning into Brahman with qualities. And that deepest quality is conscious, the universe conscious of itself, or love is the experience of that oneness. Not as where it started from, but where it's going. And in that way, kind of, I think Pierre Tiertejana had that idea as well. I think it's a lovely, I'm not seeing it as a fixed point either, like him. Like it's not. I'm not saying there's a place. It's just that it's unfolding to deeper and deeper potentials.
Have you talked to Stu Kaufman? I mean, you both go to Science and Non-Duality.
I have, yes.
Yeah.
We talked there.
He's got that notion of the adjacent possible. That's very keyed into this whole thing. That it's growing into, it's like it's expanding into the adjacent possible.
That is exactly a beautiful way of saying the same intuition, I think. So that the adjacent possible is, it's actually, it's like, it's the coexistent for me. It's like, look, what marks out what existence is the coexistence of everything that's come into form, and the formless potentiality, the flow of time, which is what everything is, and the timeless non-dual essence, which is what everything isn't. It's the potentiality for what could be, and that those coexist right now in this moment, which is why when I touch it, there's a timelessness, but I only touch it through time.
Mm-hmm. So do you what do you I'll just turn it on you. Okay. Where do you think this is, like, is there an end game?
Yeah, great question. And then I'm going to turn it back to you.
Yeah.
So for me, as you turn it on me first, I have no idea that there is that's where it's all going. In fact, to be honest with you, my intuition, and who the hell knows, would be it never started, it never ends. That the past is in every moment, including the Big Bang and the Big Bang before that, and is the past. Is arising from what's happened before, and although I can't possibly comprehend the idea that goes back and back and back eternal, I suspect it does. And the same with the going forward. But within this little narrative of this universe, and then Tim's little life in this universe, and the journey of my soul beyond Tim, I think there is, which is the whole process is. Let me come in at this a different way. It seems to me, Michael, that it's not so much that it has a purpose, it's that the purpose is inherent in what existence is. And that existence is the realization of potentiality in ever more emergent ways. That's what it is. And it's ever more emergent because it accumulates. And therefore, that's its purpose. That's what it is. And therefore, the universe is that. And it is reaching towards ever more emergent ways. And it's reached this far so far. And I think it's giving birth to another level right now. And that level is that what you call that cosmic consciousness, that conscious oneness. It's flowering into God. And Tim's journey within that, as an individuated aspect of it, on this level of soul or psyche, this non-material level which I exist on, is a part of that. Is something which is one filament in the great light that is arising, and that my role as I go through the experience of life and death is to manifest my most emergent aspects based on my past and play into that cosmic story, which feels profoundly meaningful to me and beautiful, and more than anything, it redeems the past. It redeems the suffering. It redeems the pointlessness. It redeems the mechanicalness. It redeems all the less emergent levels which I live with, because it's moving towards this greater good, which is calling, which is emerging. So that's an attempt at an answer, and I'd be interested to hear your reaction and to hear your own answer.
Yeah, I regard things in a similar way, I suppose. I'm extremely skeptical of origins and destinies as narrative devices. So, and also in general, I think a lot of this in this conversation has come from my skepticism around the idea of entropy itself, around, and my hunch that information is conserved at that
I completely agree with you.
Well, that when we talk about order, we're always talking about order with a frame around it, that this cluster of molecules is more or less predictable in time 1 than it is in time 0. And so that, again, that it blocks out all of the other possibilities. Like recently, quantum physicists have managed to quote unquote reverse time in these like very small systems, right? And really all that means is that they've managed to create in that system a moment with lower entropy later on than earlier. But they do that by injecting information into the system, right? Like the information comes from somewhere.
Yeah.
And so
exactly.
Again, this is like just me sort of beating a dead horse here back to life, which is that I don't know, like to talk about where we're going, to talk about an end game suggests that I'm willing to make claims about the boundedness of our universe in ways that I find very, very uncomfortable. That I'm not willing to say that we can, that basically everything that we know about the universe is anchored in our subjectivity. It's anchored in a local understanding. And that local understanding is constantly changing under evolutionary pressures. And so, I guess for me, like where this takes me in terms of what to expect, and I'm writing a whole book about this, although I have been so busy being a new dad that I haven't written anything in months, but I am in theory writing a book about how I think we thread the needle of this debate between, let's call them sort of evolutionary optimists and evolutionary pessimists, or whatever, people that think we're going up the elevator or down, and say that we even have these two different angles on it because what we're calling entropy creates metabolisms in order to better model the environment, and that those metabolisms have differences of opinion, and that those differences of opinion like Jessica Flack was talking about, create the sort of emergent group mentation. So at any rate, what we, what I think is going on here is that you talk about like the growth into greater good, which I agree with, but I regard it as a kind of, like a Rudolf Steiner talks about luciferic drives, and that this movement into greater possibility, into greater opportunity, must by necessity include more forms of limitation, more forms of fragmentation, more forms of violence, and that we are growing both edges of that adjacent into both, we're growing omnidimensionally into the adjacent possible. So
yes, I completely agree.
So that, and that this is why I talk about involution and evolution together.
Hold that. I want to come back. It seems to me that, firstly, just in case, I don't think you'll think of this of me, but if anyone listening, I mean, I just, because often people hear evolution, people say, oh, look, things, it's moving towards the good, and then some crass idea of progress arises, or everything's just getting better, and obviously not. Evolution has been a chaotic right from the start, and up and down and in and out, and I'm sure it will continue to be. Certainly it is in one's individual life, that's for sure. But it seems to me that the evolutionary impulse, the accumulation of the past in the time stream, in this stream of existence, is happening on every level always. So it's not like it's like everything's still doing it. I mean, I presume on the most primitive levels, things are still evolving. Certainly in the biological sphere, things are evolving. It's just very, very slow. By the time it gets to thought, it's evolving so fast. It's happening now as we're meeting. It's like it's actually evolving as we're watching. So there are different levels of emergence all evolving. So, like you said, violence. I mean, the weaponry is also emergent, and we've got much more emergent weapons now, and that's not a good thing. So we've gone from sharpened poles to fucking nuclear weapons, and that's an emergent path. So the thing which is the cutting edge, I think, is always the most emergent element of the most emergent level. And the most emergent level now is really not weaponry. The most emergent level is happening deep in soul. So the most emergent level of the most emergent level is moving into it. The problem is that everything is still emergent. So until we have to actually interact with those other levels from our own depth to influence them, rather than, and in that way, I think you're right, it will always involve an increase in everything, or not, it doesn't have to always do it, but there will be a tendency towards an increce in everything. I want to sorry, go on. You speak back, but I want to ask you a question.
Go for it.
I want to ask you, I want to kind of cut through we've been all over the place with ideas here, and it's been fun. I just want to cut to you personally. So you're a dad, you're in the middle of life, allegedly, if which probably actually it's like when people told me I was middle-aged when I was 50, it was like, wow, really? You think I'm going to live to 100? It's like, yeah, so you are, for me, you're young, and you're here, you're smart, you're dad, and you're going to die.
For sure.
So it feels like to understand this thing we're in and to know what it means, we have to have something which can help us understand that fact. And I wondered what your intuitions, feelings, hunches, guesses, imaginings, whatever you want to call them, are in response to not just this cosmic evolutionary process, not just Michael's particular life, but the fact of of death,
of my death specifically.
Everyone's, but including yours.
I mean, I think all of what I've said today is shaped, informed by a conviction, a metaphysical conviction in the balance of things. In the notion that the arrows that we draw in the world and the trends that we identify are incomplete. And so even though right now I'm in a body that experiences time in a particular way and marks the beginning and end of my life, I really feel that all of the things that we've talked about in terms of cosmic evolution are applicable to my understanding of my own life and my own mind, and that when those structures fail, when the structures by which I orient myself in a flow of information cease to work for me to orient myself, that I'm not sure if there is a loss or a gain in the dimensionality of experience. Like, I'm not sure if, and maybe there are, it's like everything else that I've been saying, it's like maybe there are useful ways to see it in both senses. But that, you know, like Ram Dass talked about Neem Karoli Baba talking about death as if taking off a shoe that's too tight, you know, that the notion of the brain, you know, Aldous Huxley talking about it as a reducing valve. But then of course it's, I mean, in some sense it is, it's an attempt to make the most parsimonious use of the resources we have in order to navigate the environment as effectively as we can, I think. And so, if there is, yeah, I mean, basically, I would regard the timeless as a dimension, and it wouldn't surprise me if at the moment of my death, I am just sort of called back into the sense-making retrospective of whatever my life contributes to informationally. That, like, this is what people, when they talk about, like, you know, rejoining some sort of divine mind, that for me, like, I kind of suspect that there is, you know, I have a friend who talks, he's like, what if we're just the past life regressions of our future selves, you know, and that all of this is just like a memory of us that we're having of ourselves at some future point, a dream. I don't know. I guess it possibly is just the residue of Judeo-Christian parenting, but I do believe in a New Jerusalem, sort of. You know, I do believe in a shining city at the end of time, sort of. But in whatever sense we can legitimately talk about it as existing in the future, it for sure, and much more easily to argue, exists right now in a dimension that we're not normally accessing or considering in our conversations about time. You know, that I like the eternal is like, you know, again, like, you know, there's at every moment in the symphony, there's a sense in which the entire symphony exists. This is just me being comfortable in that position, that sense that at the end of this sort of narrative mode, that there will be that, yeah, that the recording, if not the score, still exists somewhere or nowhere, and that, yeah, that really ultimately it doesn't, you know, that, I mean, mortality is, you know, my college roommate was always talking about dying every night when he went to sleep, you know, waking up, being born again every morning. Yeah, I don't know. I just, and then there's also the fact that, like, my own body is this other, you know, it's immensely strange, it's forever wild and foreign. And to the extent that we talk about life as emerging from non-life, then I am made out of the dead thing, like I am. And there's a deep non-duality that we can examine in this snapshot in which the self and the other, the living and the dead, are taken up into something transcendent to those categories. And so I don't know. I mean, to me, death is just sort of like a reorganization, an internal reorganization. And I don't really expect it to, I don't know. I shouldn't say it doesn't concern me, because obviously I grieve when I lose a family member or that kind of thing. But I think that there's a really important sense in which that, die before dying, like recognize the ways in which these categories are not serving us in our understanding of how truly strange our world really is. I don't know.
I do. It is truly strange. That is for sure. And I think death becomes more of an issue once you get to be 60, and as the journey comes through. So yeah,
what about you? We know this. So you talked about this on Future Fossils. You really you believe that you're leaving an imaginal residue, right? That
I think everything is leaving a residue. I think everything is the past. I think this moment includes the past within it. And I think I don't think that's disputable. Every moment contains within it everything that's ever happened before, everything. So that's why when you say information isn't lost, it's like, clearly it's not. Now the ability to access it may be lost, but it hasn't. The information itself hasn't been lost. It's all there. And your stuff about entropy, I thought was deep, because it's actually what's happening. I've heard it, like entropy is like the river, and life is like the fish going upstream. I remember an image being given of that kind of the way that it seems to be moving in the opposite direction. And that, for me, that's like, well, look, that's because the information's getting onto higher and higher levels, more and more emergent levels. And now it's reached a level of soul or psyche where it's not even made of matter. It's completely new level. So part of my interest in exploring how to synthesize science and spirituality is because my own experience of being around death, which I've been around a lot, points me very strongly to the idea that spirituality is saying something, and that central to the spiritual idea is not just ideas of oneness and awakening, although that's big, and timelessness, but actually central to just about every form of spirituality is about death, and about the idea that this thing we're experiencing as soul is not subject to death in the way that this thing we're experiencing as body is, and that they are distinct. And I loved it when you talked about your body as the other, because for me, it's like, I really think we need to take that old insight seriously, but in a different way. So the traditional insight is, you're not your body. You have one, but you're not. And actually, it feels to me like the body is, I have a relationship with it, but it's got its own agenda. It's got its own, its own needs. It has its own, it's doing its own thing. And I'm relating to it. And we're on completely different levels of emergence now. We're in a symbiotic relationship. I do think we've emerged in the evolutionary process in one narrative, but now I think that we're in the two levels of information are in a symbiotic relationship, a bit like a computer in the cloud or something like that. And that they're in a symbiotic relationship, they're moving together, but when this drops, this is still there. So I think the whole question for me around death is simply, does this experience of imagination stop when the experience of sensation stops? And my own hunch is, no, it doesn't. And the experience you were saying of it's all there, I've spoken to huge numbers of people who've had near-death experiences, and of this idea of a life review seems very interesting to me, that it is all there. And that kind of feels right to me, that it's all there. And that partly because it feels like, what do I take with me? I take what I am. And what am I? I'm everything I've ever experienced. That's what I am. I'm the past of Tim. And the past of Tim is meeting the past of Michael in this new potential, which is, for me, is a creative, is not what's already happened that we're remembering or anything. Nothing. No. Much bigger. Much, much, much richer than that. This is brand new. And we get to play a role in where it's going to go because we are it playing that role. That's what we are. We are the emergent universe choosing where to go next and on a journey which doesn't end with death. That's where I've ended up with my story.
Yeah, I like the ending the story with an interrogation of the idea of the end of the story. I can fly with that.
And one of the great things, which for me, I love in the way you approach things, is this bringing together opposites. Because I do think we can do that. I think we have to be careful how we do it. But I do think that life is deeply paradoxical. So one of the things perhaps we can explore this just to end with together is, to me, the story never replaces the mystery. That I need both. And that the timeless quality is always the unknowing. It's the, and that's what I lead people to in the awakening work that I do. And then there's the living your life, which requires maps, stories, and usually fragmented ones that don't fit together. So the more they can be integrated and richer and open up deeper experience, the better. But the moment they replace the mystery, the thing which we're actually in, then it feels like we've lost it. And so much of what happens when ideas become tight is because we're just eating the menu and forgotten the meal. And then we can come back to this enormous, endless mystery. And I think part of the thing which I see in you when you're talking is if I've got it right, is the desire not to lose that, is to keep it open, to keep it. And that's honoring the possible.
Speed Levitch says, and I love this so much, I've been using it in my bio for years. He says, I refuse to be enslaved by a single perspective.
Yeah. Beautiful. Because everything is a perspective. And that's the first idea we started off on this journey, which was the evolving of perspectives. So there's plenty of them, which is why it's so lovely to share your perspective, Michael, and play out these things. And I feel richer for it. So thank you so much.
Super fun. Thank you.
Yeah, it has been.
Yeah. I love going playful toe to toe like this.
I think so too. And part of the reason I want to do this is because
nothing at stake.
I want to model how we can do this so that people do it, because I see, I live much more in the spiritual world than I do in the scientific community, although I move between both. And what happens in the spiritual world is either you're in a bubble of ideas which are kind of enclosed and you're in, or you're incredibly polite and not allowed to disagree because everyone has their own reality. And it's like, look, both of those don't feel right to me. Maybe there's a way we can explore.
Yeah, that everyone is entitled to their own reality perspective seems like the preconditions for the fall of civilization. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying.
Yeah. I've never heard it put quite as articulately, but yeah. Yeah.
Anyway, well, thank you so much.
Thank you. And
it's been getting people to ask these questions.
Cool. Thank you for your loveliness. And I will. This will be out probably in September sometime, okay. And I will send you all of that. And could you, Michael? Could you email me just like a one-liner of? I've looked at how you describe it. You are a man of so many different aspects. It's hard to know how to describe you. So if you've got a line that you would like me to describe you as, and a website you'd like me to link to, can you just send me that?
I will do that. Yeah, thank you.
And then I can make sure I get the information that'll, people can go, I'd like to know more of this strange chappie.
Yeah, that sounds good.
I feel like I've already known him in the future.
I don't know. I mean, you might. I imagine you're a voracious reader, and
No,
that
you'd be wrong. I used to be a voracious reader.
yeah.
But
And
as I've got older, I read less and less and less.
yeah, that's pretty. That seems to be par for the course as people sort of, deepen into contemplative work. That said, I would love to know if you're ever inspired to actually read time loops.
Okay, I'm putting it on my list. I'm doing it now.
Because he's not for the same reason that I loved reading Timothy Morton, who is such a contrarian and such a, in some ways, like, I find his perspective like meaningful, and like this is an absolutely necessary component of the what I'm building to make sense of things. And yet for him to insist that it's like the way is patently ridiculous, right? And I think there's a similar sense in which I don't completely agree with Eric Wargo about his stuff. Like, I think there's good reasons to believe that there are forms of telepathy that are not you just intuiting a future informational state of your own brain. But the notion that the afterlife, that the bardo is present in every moment, and that in some sense death is the release of the individual from the flow of history.
Depends what you mean by history, then, doesn't it? Because it feels like, I mean, I guess for me it just feels like, look, the bardo's present. We're in it now.
Right.
We're in a non-spatial, non-physical dimension. It's where we've been hanging out the whole time. The bodies have been sitting here moving about a little bit, but mainly all the activities.
But non-temporal, right? Also.
Yeah. Well, it depends what you mean by time. It's not. There is a. If you, I think of time just purely as sequence. One thing follows another, and it includes what's happened before. So it's not. It is temporal in that sense, but it has a different relationship with this. So you can have, huge. One of the things I used to do when I was much younger and crazier was make myself deliberately pass out.
I did that too. Yeah.
Yeah. So you'd go, you'd be out for about a few seconds, and then you'd have these huge visionary experiences and dreams and all this, which went on forever. And you go, fuck, I've just been out for 5 seconds. How can that be true? Because they're not a bit like dreams generally, but it's still temporal in the sense of it's still fitted in those 5 seconds, and it was a sequence of events. So it feels like the timeless, the formless, the silence in which it's all arising. It has no form. It's everything which is in form, even the bardos is form. Is in that sense an unfolding of time. That because it just every experience is always time. It's impossible to have experience without that because it feels like the abstraction is the idea of a thing that's not time. There's only a flow of time. That's what it all is. Hey, we've just started up again. That's no good.
Yeah, I was gonna say, well, now we can finally get into like I think it was Lee Smolin and his team of people that were working on like space-time as a it's about networked causal interrelations between quantum states.
I find Lee Smolin's stuff fantastic. I really like him a lot.
Yeah, so the notion
I just bought Time Reborn, actually.
Good. I haven't read it, so
yeah, I just got it, and see that's rare for me. So he must have impressed me. So I went out and went, I've got to read that.
Well,
mainly because I just get so disappointed, Michael, with books.
Well, report back to me after Time Reborn, because I think in what limited interactions I've had with like hardcore physicists at SFI, it does seem as though there's a comfort in that conversation that surprised me, with the notion that with this paradox that the future, like that the whole universe, all moments of time exist from some perspective, but that we, that we are.
So that's the idea that Lee is really coming against.
Yeah, is it?
Yeah, that's what he's like. Why I relate to him so much is he's going, look, time is reality. Time is not an illusion, and physics has got itself into a whole dead end, thinking that with something which is from our, certainly from our everyday experiences, complete nuts, and could actually be nuts. So I think he's a physicist who's coming back to. That's why it's time reborn. It's like no, this is the fundamental category here. And I think he's right. I think he's absolutely right. I think it is one of the fundamental.
Do you know where he stands with respect to like Carlo Rovelli? Because Carlo Rovelli has a similar sort of like time is that there is such a thing as past and future, but only sort of from within an observer, like only from within a system modeling its environment, because then we're manipulating information in a way that, leads to, I don't know.
I have no idea, but I think the whole thing comes from the fact that science has had its greatest successes with physics, and physics is the least creative level of emergence. So it can imagine, and because it's reductionist, because it functions on the basis that you can understand the more emergent by reducing it to the less emergent, which I think is a complete and absolute mistake. The opposite is the truth. The whole point of emergence is you can't reduce it to the less emergent. You just can't. I mean, for me, it's like, if there was all the chemicals that make up my body sitting on this chair, it would not be having a conversation with you. It's just like, this is more, reductionism is just wrong. But it's so prevalent. So it's just this. And if you have underneath it this idea that the basic levels are more real than the more emergent levels, then you end up with a deterministic universe, and then there is no creativity, and so the future is already happened. If you just take a Newtonian worldview, the future has happened. We don't need to go cosmic on it. It just happened because everything's determined. But the mistake is that that's true on the least emergent levels, or becomes more true, or it's so uncreative you can't see it move. That's why it takes billions of years to do anything. Right. But on the more emergent levels, it's really creative and fast, and it's not deterministic in the slightest. It's open-ended. The possible, from which is motivating the whole thing the whole way through, is interacting, is really obvious. And as soon as you get rid of of reductionism, then the whole necessity to have time as fixed just goes out the window, and you can go back to a much more obvious way that we actually experience, which is that there's a flow of emergence, and we're of time, and we're creative within it. And you've got free will, which exists on this level, but not on the level of atoms, and so on and so on, because you haven't got caught in that deterministic trap. And then all of those issues just disappear. They're gone.
All right. Well, I want to keep picking at this forever.
Yes.
Let's.
You probably will, like me.
Let's take a breather here. Yeah.
We should. It's been lovely speaking to you, and God bless you, and enjoy being a dad and all of that beautiful particularness as it unfolds.
Likewise. Have fun with your. You've got one or both kids at home now.
They're both at home, well, kind of in and out, but they're 24 and 19 now. So, it's a hell of a journey. It's fantastic.
So you actually, you had your, I was just thinking about that. I was like, she'll be 25 when I'm 60. So, okay. So you had your kid about the same time. Yeah. Awesome. All right. Well, thanks, man.
Lovely to see you.
Lovely to see you. Take care. I'll talk to you soon.